The miners' lamps flickered against the damp rock walls, their boots crunching on decades of silence. Then a hollow thud, a collapse of dirt, and something pale emerged from the shadows. A skull. Dust swirled as the team froze, realizing they hadn't just uncovered stone, but the forgotten remains of human lives buried deep beneath the earth. Welcome to Missing Shadows, the channel that uncovers the forgotten, the vanished, and the untold. Hit subscribe, because every shadow hides a story. The year was 1982, in a fading mining town tucked against the mountains of West Virginia. Back then, the town breathed coal dust and small dreams. Families worked hard, children carried their parents' hopes, and the mines stood like sleeping giants, both feared and respected. Among the young faces of that era were 12 high school juniors who, like most teenagers, straddled the fragile line between innocence and adulthood. They were restless, hungry for adventure, and bound together by the shared boredom of small-town life. There was Mark Jennings, the natural leader, always with a baseball cap pulled low and a grin that drew others in. His best friend, Daniel Price, was quieter, more reflective, the kind of boy who carried a sketchbook even on hikes. Anna Mayfield, with her quick wit and laughter, made friends easily, while her cousin Claire, shy and bookish, followed behind, scribbling poetry in a weathered notebook. The group often gathered near the edge of the abandoned Ridgewood mine, a sprawling network of shafts long since shuttered after a fatal collapse 2 decades earlier. Parents warned them to stay away, not just because of the danger, but because of the stories. Whispers of men who'd gone in and never returned. Whispers of voices that echoed from tunnels too deep to be explained. But teenagers rarely heed warnings. On the last weekend of May, the 12 decided to hike near They packed light sandwiches, sodas, flashlights for fun. A few carried cassette players, their favorite songs rattling in the warm evening air. The hike began with laughter, with teasing, with the kind of joy that only comes before tragedy hardens a town forever. One witness, a younger boy who'd begged to join but had been turned away, remembered watching them disappear along the tree-lined trail. He recalled the way their voices faded into the hills, the sound of someone singing off-key, and the last glimpse of Mark waving his cap before the group rounded the bend. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. When night fell and none of the students returned home, panic set in quickly. Parents called one another, convinced at first that the group had simply lingered too long. But when dawn arrived with no sign of them, fear sank its claws into Ridgewood. By Sunday morning, search parties combed the trails, calling out names that echoed unanswered against the mountain walls. Dogs picked up faint scents, but every trail ended at the yawning mouth of Ridgewood Mine. Locals whispered that the mine had finally claimed them, swallowed them whole, as it had swallowed others before. The sheriff's office marked the entrance with tape, lanterns flickering in the dark. Families stood at the barricade, staring into the black tunnel, as though sheer will might bring their children back. Mothers clutched photographs. Fathers argued with deputies. The town, for the first time in decades, fell silent except for the desperate cries of names lost to the hills. The 12 students were gone, vanished, and Ridgewood would never be the same again. Asterisk, asterisk, the disappearance of 12 students shook Ridgewood to its core. In a town where everyone knew everyone, the loss felt like a knife driven into its heart. The sheriff's office launched an immediate search, and for weeks the hills swarmed with deputies, volunteers, and even state rescue teams. Helicopters traced wide circles above the ridges. Bloodhounds combed every trail. Divers scoured nearby rivers, though the waters revealed nothing. At first, hope still flickered. People believed the students might have gotten lost, that they were huddled together somewhere waiting for rescue. Flyers with smiling school portraits, papered gas stations, and church bulletin boards. Mothers cooked meals for the search crews. Fathers grabbed shovels, lanterns, and rope, venturing near the mine's dangerous edges. But as days turned into weeks, hope frayed. Searchers found no footprints, no scattered belongings, no sign of struggle. It was as though the students had stepped into the earth itself and vanished without a trace. Rumors bloomed in the absence of answers. Some whispered that the teenagers had run away deliberately, a secret pact to escape Ridgewood's suffocating grip. Others leaned toward darker theories that an unknown drifter had passed through town, luring them to their deaths. The old miners, grizzled men who remembered the shaft collapses of the 60s, claimed the Ridgewood mine had always been cursed. They told stories in hushed tones about strange lights in the tunnels, about voices that weren't there, about the mountains swallowing those who dared to disturb its silence. The sheriff, a weary man named Harold Cutter, stood before crowds in the high school gymnasium, offering updates that grew emptier by the week. His uniform looked more wrinkled each time, his eyes darker. "We're doing everything we can," he'd say, but the townspeople could hear the truth behind his words. Nothing was being found. Nothing was moving forward. Families unraveled under the weight of uncertainty. Anna Mayfield's mother, once lively and full of church hymns, grew thin and silent, staring from her porch toward the mountains each evening. Daniel Price's father stopped working at the mill altogether, spending his days walking the trail that led to the mine, as though retracing the path might somehow summon his boy back. Claire's little brother, only 8 at the time, grew up believing his sister had simply gone into the woods one day and never returned, a fact too large and unexplainable for a child to bear. The town held vigils by candlelight, but grief without bodies is a grief that never settles. The pews of Ridgewood's church overflowed with tears and prayers. Pastors spoke of faith and mystery, but behind closed doors, parents whispered doubts. How could God allow 12 children to vanish without a trace? After 6 months, the official search was scaled back. Deputies returned to routine patrols. The state troopers left. Helicopters no longer circled the ridges. What remained were parents who still walked the trails with flashlights. Long after the rest of the world had stopped looking, the sheriff's office kept a file labeled Ridgewood 12. Thin sheets of paper, faded photographs, a map marked with circles that led nowhere. It gathered dust on a shelf, occasionally pulled down when a new tip arrived, though tips rarely did. By the following year, the headlines had vanished from regional newspapers. Ridgewood was just another town with a mystery, another tragedy unsolved. But inside Ridgewood itself, time didn't heal, it hardened. Every anniversary brought back the same aching questions. Each graduation ceremony carried an empty space where 12 young faces should have stood. The mine, sealed off with rotting boards and warning signs, loomed like a wound at the edge of town. Children grew up hearing the story whispered on playgrounds, daring each other to approach the barricade. Teenagers told ghost stories of seeing flickering lights in the tunnels at night, or hearing faint laughter in the wind. Parents, though, locked their doors earlier, warned their kids more sharply, and carried the quiet knowledge that sometimes people simply disappeared and were never found by the end of the decade. The Ridgewood 12 had become both legend and scar, Outsiders would ask, "Isn't that the town where those kids went missing?" And locals would bristle, turning away. It was a story no one wanted to tell, yet one that lingered in every empty chair at a dinner table, in every mother's quiet sigh, in every shadow cast by the mountains at dusk. The case, for all official purposes, had gone cold, but for Ridgewood, the chill of unanswered loss never left. 4 decades later, Ridgewood was a quieter place, its mining days long behind it. The shafts that once gave the town life now lay sealed and forgotten, their entrances hidden by vines and decades of neglect. Most of the old miners had passed on, and with them went the town's industry. What remained was a scattering of weathered homes, a diner that still served coffee too strong, and the lingering memory of the 12 who never came back. The mine should have stayed sealed. But in the spring of 2022, a land surveyor contracted by a development company stumbled across a collapsed portion of Ridgewood Mine. The company planned to assess whether the land was stable enough for logging rights. What they found instead stopped everything. It began with a hollow sound when the surveyor's drill hit the thin earth above a shaft. By the second day, a section of ground gave way. Beneath it lay a pocket of untouched tunnel, preserved like a time capsule. The air that rose up smelled of iron, mildew, and something far heavier, the unmistakable scent of death. Old, but not forgotten, the county sheriff's office, now led by Sheriff Dana Holloway, was notified immediately. Holloway, born a decade after the disappearances, had grown up hearing the story whispered in Ridgewood. She remembered her grandmother pointing at the mountains and muttering, "That place keeps its secrets." Now, those secrets were literally opening beneath her boots. Within hours, crime scene tape fluttered across the clearing. Flashing lights bathed the woods in red and blue as forensic teams and deputies set up flood lamps at the mine entrance. Holloway stood at the edge, staring into the darkness, aware that what lay inside would reopen wounds some families had spent 40 years trying to stitch. Closed. The first descent was cautious. The ground was unstable, the wooden supports rotted to splinters. The air clung heavy to the lungs. But within minutes, the team's radios crackled with confirmation. Skeletal remains. Multiple sets. News spread faster than wildfire. By dawn, reporters from across the state descended on Ridgewood. Their vans lined up along the narrow roads, cameras aimed at the forest. Headlines splashed across screens. Human remains found in abandoned mine, possible linked to 40-year-old mystery. For the families of the missing, the phone calls felt surreal. Anna Mayfield's younger brother, now in his 50s, received the sheriff's call while at work in Charleston. He dropped the phone, sobbing, decades of uncertainty crashing down in an instant. Daniel Price's mother, now frail and living in a nursing home, gripped the arm of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white when told remains had been found. Through tears, she whispered, my boy's coming home." Not all reactions were the same. Some relatives had built entire lives on the foundation of unanswered questions. To have those questions reopened was both a gift and a wound. Closure, they discovered, was not simple. Inside the mine, evidence slowly came to light. Rusted flashlights, scraps of fabric turned brittle with time, a backpack still intact enough to hold a folded note. Investigators catalogued each find with painstaking care. Some remains were tangled together as if the students had huddled in fear. Others were scattered, suggesting chaos in those final moments. Sheriff Holloway knew the mine itself might finally tell the story the town had been waiting to hear. But she also knew that stories, especially ones buried for 40 years, rarely emerged clean by the second week. Forensic teams confirmed what many suspected. The remains matched the number of students who vanished in 1982. All 12 had been found, yet questions outnumbered answers. Why had no one discovered them sooner? Why did they enter the mine despite warnings? And most chilling of all, did they die by accident, or had someone sealed them inside? The town of Ridgewood stirred with old memories and fresh fear. Vigils reignited, families gathered once more in the church, and everywhere people whispered. The mine had given up its dead. Now, Ridgewood braced for the truth. Asterisk, when the news confirmed that all 12 students had been found, the town of Ridgewood seemed to hold its breath. For outsiders, it was a headline. For those who lived through it, it was the reopening of scars that had never truly healed. For the families, the grief was not new. It was something they had carried like a stone in their chest for 4 decades. But now, with the discovery of the mine, grief became flesh again. Old photographs were pulled from drawers. Dusty yearbooks were reopened, and each family began revisiting the past in ways they thought they'd buried long ago. Anna Mayfield's mother, Margaret, had been a choir singer when Anna vanished. Her voice had once filled Sunday mornings with hymns, bright and clear. But after her daughter disappeared, she never sang again. The silence stretched through their home, heavy as fog. Margaret's husband tried to pull her back into life, but eventually he passed away from a sudden heart attack, leaving Margaret to grow old alone. Now, frail and nearly blind, she sat in her living room when Sheriff Holloway visited to deliver the confirmation. She clutched the officer's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Please, please tell me it was quick." The sheriff had no answer. Daniel Price's younger brother, Michael, had been 8 years old when Daniel vanished. He grew up in the shadow of a sibling who never got to finish high school, never got to graduate, never got to live. Michael became the son who was constantly compared to the one who was gone. Teachers, neighbors, even his own parents measured him against Daniel's memory. He admitted, years later, that he carried guilt, as if surviving while his brother didn't was something shameful. Now, at 50, he stood at the mine entrance when officials allowed families a brief look. He whispered into the cold mountain air, "You're not forgotten, Danny, you never were." Claire's cousin, Emily, had been best friends with her since childhood. When Claire vanished, Emily's teenage years twisted into something different. She grew up too fast, marrying young, moving away, always trying to escape Ridgewood's ghost. But even in another state, she felt it trailing her. She once admitted in a letter to her daughter, "Every time you walk out the door, I count the hours until you return, because I know what it means to lose someone and never get them back." When Emily returned for the vigil in 2022, her hands trembled as she placed a candle by the church steps. "I should have been there with you, Claire," she whispered. For some families, the discovery shattered carefully built lives. One father, who had moved away decades earlier, never spoke of his daughter's disappearance to his second family. Now, with the news surfacing, old wounds were exposed to children who had never known about their half-sister. Secrets became conversations. Grief stretched across generations. Yet, within the sorrow, there was something else, a flicker of connection. Families who had grown apart over the years reunited. Cousins who hadn't spoken in decades hugged outside the church. Old classmates, now grandparents, shared stories of the 12, remembering laughter, pranks, and dances at the gymnasium. For one evening, Ridgewood remembered not just the tragedy, but the lives themselves. The vigil was the largest the town had seen in years. Hundreds gathered outside the church, candles casting soft halos in the night. Photographs of the 12 students were pinned to boards, their youthful faces smiling at a town forever frozen in 1982. Sheriff Holloway stood at the podium, her voice steady but her eyes wet. Tonight, Ridgewood remembers. Tonight, we honor not just what was lost, but what was finally found. As the candles flickered, some found themselves praying for the first time in years. Others stood in silence, staring at the photographs, trying to reconcile the faces of teenagers with the bones that had lain in the mine for 4 decades. Grief is not linear. Some felt relief. Some felt anger. Some felt both in the same breath. A few parents, now in their 80s, confessed they had long feared dying without knowing where their children were. For them, the discovery was an answer to a prayer they had whispered for 40 years. Yet the answer did not erase the ache. What struck the town most deeply was the resilience of love across time. Despite years of silence, despite families splintering, despite hope fading, the memory of the Ridgewood 12 had endured. Their names had been spoken again, their faces had been seen again, and now, finally, their families could lay them to rest. But even as the candles burned low, questions still loomed. How had the 12 ended up in that mine? What had happened in their final moments? And most haunting of all, had someone put them there? For months after the discovery, the Ridgewood investigation churned like a restless tide. Forensic teams sifted through every bone fragment, every scrap of fabric, every rusted buckle, desperate to piece together the story of what had happened inside the mine. Families waited for updates, their patience worn thin by decades of silence. The town buzzed with speculation, some of it wild, some of it chillingly plausible. The evidence began to form a picture, though fractured at first. The bones showed signs of blunt trauma, but not the kind inflicted by weapons. Instead, fractures suggested falling rock. Soil samples confirmed there had been a collapse inside the shaft, sudden, violent enough to trap anyone unlucky enough to be there. It seemed the simplest explanation, an accident. But then came the details that complicated everything. Among the items recovered was a rusted lunchbox, wedged against a rock near the collapsed entrance. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a note scribbled on notebook paper. The handwriting matched Anna Mayfield's. The note was brief, almost frantic. "We can't get out. The way is blocked. Mark says we'll try the other tunnel. If anyone finds this, tell Mom I'm sorry." That single scrap of paper confirmed what investigators had feared. The students had been alive after the collapse, trapped inside, waiting for a rescue that never came. But why hadn't rescuers found them in 1982? Search teams had combed the area for weeks. Sheriff Holloway pressed her team for answers, and it was then that the darker part of Ridgewood's history began to re-emerge. Old county records showed that after the initial disappearance, mining officials from Ridgewood Coal had pressured the sheriff's office to keep search efforts away from the deeper mine shafts. At the time, the company was already under investigation for safety violations. If rescuers had gone deeper, they might have uncovered evidence of illegal mining operations and shoddy safety measures. Quietly, the entrances were sealed under the guise of stabilization. In reality, the company had buried not only their mistakes, but also the possibility of saving 12 trapped students. When this revelation surfaced in 2022, it sent shockwaves through the town. Families who had long believed in bad luck or cruel fate now faced a harsher truth. Negligence and greed had played a part in their children's deaths. Further witness accounts surfaced as well. One retired foreman, now in his 80s, confessed in a taped interview that he had been ordered to keep quiet about a shaft. Collapsed the very weekend the students vanished. "I didn't know for sure if they were in there," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I knew we were sealing men's sins with concrete, and I stayed quiet." The truth was devastating. The Ridgewood 12 had not run away. They had not been kidnapped by a stranger or lured by ghost stories. They had entered the mine seeking adventure, just as countless kids before them had dared. When the earth collapsed, they were alive, frightened, waiting in the dark. Rescue had been possible, but corporate cowardice and the silence of those in power left them entombed. Families reacted with a mixture of sorrow and fury. Some wept in gratitude that the mystery was finally solved. Others demanded justice, even if those responsible were already in their graves. At a public meeting in the town hall, emotions boiled over. One man shouted, "They could have been saved. My brother could have lived his life." Others stood silently, holding photographs of the 12, letting their presence speak for itself. Sheriff Holloway, standing before the crowd, chose her words carefully. The Ridgewood 12 were failed twice, first by the collapse, then by the silence that followed. Tonight, we speak that truth out loud, and we will not let it die in shadows again. The town, long weighed down by unanswered questions, now carried the heavy burden of truth. Closure was complicated. There was no neat ending when negligence had stolen futures. Yet there was also a strange kind of peace. The mine's silence had finally been broken. On a cold October morning, the remains of the 12 students were laid to rest side by side in Ridgewood Cemetery. Coffins draped with flowers lined the hillside as the town gathered in reverence. Bells tolled, tears flowed, and for the first time in 40 years, families could whisper goodbye. But beneath the grief lay a collective vow. Ridgewood would not forget again. Asterisk, the mine was finally sealed off. Not as a crime scene, but as hallowed ground. Days of excavation and forensic work had given the town of Hollow Creek more answers than they ever expected, and more heartbreak than they were prepared to hold. The students hadn't simply disappeared. They had been trapped, waiting, fighting for survival in the choking dark. The carvings, the locket, the barricaded chamber, they told a story of hope, of fear, and of young lives cut short. What no police report could capture was the sound of silence that filled those tunnels after their voices faded at the memorial service. The town gathered under a gray sky. Names of the 12 students were read aloud, each followed by the toll of the church bell. Families clutched photographs, long kept in wallets and frames, the edges worn smooth from decades of holding on to hope. Mrs. Keaton, her hands trembling, placed a flower on the memorial stone that now bore her brother's name. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You can rest now." Sheriff Dalton stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand. He had carried many cases, but this one had become more than an investigation. It had pulled him into the heart of a town's grief, into the echoes of a tragedy everyone had tried to bury along with the mine. And yet, as heavy as the truth was, there was a strange relief in knowing the shadows no longer held the children captive. Reporters asked their questions, looking for headlines, but Dalton's words weren't for them. This isn't about blame or scandal. It's about remembering that these were kids, sons, daughters, friends. They deserved to be found. And now they are. In the weeks that followed, Hollow Creek began to heal in small, almost imperceptible ways. The mine, once a symbol of loss, was fenced and marked with a plaque, transformed into a site of remembrance rather than fear. Families visited with candles. Students from the local high school painted murals in honor of those who never came home. And slowly, silence gave way to stories, the kind that kept the memory alive. Dalton, sitting in his office late one evening, flipped through the final case file. Every page carried weight, every photo of the evidence a reminder of the cost of negligence and time. Yet closing the file didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a vow that forgotten voices deserved to be heard. No matter how long it took, he drove out to the mine one last time before the barricades were locked permanently. The wind swept through the valley, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Standing at the entrance, he whispered, "We found you. We didn't forget. It wasn't justice, not in the legal sense. No arrests would be made. No single culprit could be punished. But closure isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth. Sometimes it's about finally having a place to grieve." For Hollow Creek, the story of the vanished students had haunted generations. Now it was part of their history, not an open wound, but a scar, one they would carry together. And for Sheriff Dalton, the case had left him changed. He realized that solving mysteries wasn't just about evidence and time. It was about empathy, about listening to the whispers of those who could no longer speak, and about giving families the dignity of knowing what had become of their loved ones. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the abandoned mine, Dalton turned and walked back to his truck. The past would always be there, etched into the hollow walls, but so would the resilience of those who endured. Some stories don't end neatly. They fade into silence, leaving behind a lesson. For Hollow Creek, the lesson was clear. Time can bury the truth, but it can never erase it. And so, the town moved forward, not by forgetting, but by remembering.